Welcome to Retail OCD, where we explore how headlines, trends, and technologies are impacting consumers and the retail business. I'm Deanne Campbell, store design, operations, and customer experience expert.
I'm Barney Stacher, part of the podcast where I'm Chief Conversation Officer, and I ask people like Josh Rockoff and Deanne and our other guests questions that are probing, like, how did you get here, Josh, in the world of distressed assets and let's call them zombie brands that are coming back to life from either brick and mortar and going to e-commerce only, et cetera, et cetera. So how did you get here, Josh?
You know, we should probably do a podcast talking about our own personal journeys of how we wound up where we are. I think that would actually be a lot of fun. So we're to do that in the coming weeks.
I might have to go back on the witness protection program, Josh.
Yeah, well, that's your fault. Don't share things that are going to get you in trouble. You know, for me, I had a life event and I stumbled into it. And so I started out as one of the original e-commerce developers. I helped pay for college being a developer in e-commerce, but this was 1994 when there was no such thing as e-commerce. It didn't exist. It was a figment of all of our imaginations. And so I love to say I came up with the idea of e-commerce. That's not true. It was, I did it. I've done a horrible job monetizing it. But the reality for me was I was a freshman at the University of Pennsylvania. I was 3 weeks into my freshman year. Friends of mine were, in the dorms and they were coding. And they were coding in Perl. They were coding in what's called CGI Perl. It was essentially scripting. There was no such thing as, Shopify or Klaviyo or any of these. It just didn't exist. And so a friend of mine was actually dropping out to go to work at this startup search engine called Google. And he was like, hey, would you, what kind of coding do you do? There's this guys who are asking him around looking for developers for this product, for the software company. And I was like, count me in, I could use money. I was paying my way through college. I wanted to be a professor. I studied ancient Egyptian history. So I was what you would call an Egyptologist. And I had this great professor in college, and we can talk about that on another podcast, which convinced me to merge two different worlds of Egyptology, which was Hellenistic Egyptology, or Hellenistic age, which was the death of Alexander the Great to the death of Cleopatra, and Egyptology. And I focused on that. And it was basically the Ptolemaic period. I'm sure this will get me lots of people questioning.
Yeah.
And my wife does that on almost a daily occasion anyway. But the reality was I was really passionate about it, but it's not going to pay the bills. And I got this opportunity to be a junior developer of a 3-person team, and we invented ATJ, which was the first commercial e-commerce platform. I would love to say that I had all these great epiphanies and it was an amazing thing. I was doing what I was told, right? And I coded it the way the architects told me to code it. And it was fantastic. And I got paid great money for a college student. From there, that kind of launched my career. I raised some money from the Wharton School. I wound up building a company doing web development and also commerce. So I had a web development agency. I sold it, went to work for, a big 5 consulting firm that I sold it to, left them, got another job, and started another company with a couple of people, sold that, and started really kind of building a career in this. But I got an opportunity to go to work for a big financial services firm. It really wasn't the right fit, I'll admit. I didn't want to admit it at the time, but it was perfectly the example of where sometimes you have to turn things down. And I didn't, because I was young and stupid and immature in my thinking. Certainly I said it. My kids are going to enjoy that too. But they basically recognized that I had some skills. And so they gave me a software company that they were spinning out of their company. And they were like, hey, you run it. We'll give you, minority ownership of it. You can delegate your equity stakes to whoever you want to delegate to. Build it, run it. It's yours. Obviously you have to report back. You have a board. You have to approve massive decisions with us. And so I was doing that for 17 months until 9/11. And I was in the towers on 9/11. If you Google my name and you add the letters BBC, you'll see an article that says Manhattan's new homeless. And I was homeless. I was living in a homeless shelter. I lost everything. When the BBC wrote the article about me, I was literally sitting on a park bench with everything I had. It was 2 bags. That was it. And here I was, Manhattan, had what I thought was a successful company, and I was homeless. And it was just sort of a life-altering event that said, okay, what do I do now? And so I got a phone call from a friend of mine who was like, hey, I'm restarting a retailer that was struggling and was in distress. And I had no idea what any of that meant. And he's like, why don't you just come out and do diligence with me and spend a week? And this way you can take a shower. And more importantly, I could just get away from what I was dealing with. And so that's what I did. And that was my foray into distressed retail. And I will admit, I had no grounding. I had no baseline. I didn't know anything.
And you were distressed.
Yeah.
And you were dealing with your own distress. And sort of in that, you were able to parallel dealing with distressed assets.
Yeah. And so, look, a lot of what you learned, I wish I was in private equity or in venture capital when you're dealing with these distressed assets. There's a playbook that they deploy. I have my own playbook. And the reality is that, it's not just necessarily looking at the financial side of things. In most cases, if you play the cards right, you can make gold, and you can. But you have to know what you're doing. And you have to be able to understand there is a playbook by which you need to sort of check off the boxes before you step foot into it. And then after you start operating this thing, to be able to turn, dust into gold. And if you could do it well, you could do it really well. So there's, the story of Urban Decay Cosmetics was a perfect example. There was a private equity firm called Castaneda Partners. They basically, I went in with them and they bought Urban Decay Cosmetics, and I built the digital business for them. And that was a business that was basically doing a ton of money, went to nothing. I call them stripped more than they were like a distressed asset in a traditional sense. They were bought, sold a bunch of times. They lost their identity and lost their purpose. The people that were buying their product stopped buying their product because they didn't realize they were still there, and in a lot of cases aged out. And that business went from $3 million purchased to a sale 4 years later to L'Oreal for roughly $400 million. You want to talk about hitting a home run? There's your home run.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stories like that in my career where, and I certainly don't want to take credit for that entirely for that, because that's not true. There was a lot of really smart people. There were a lot of good people there. And there were a lot of really, you got a little lucky. Don't get me wrong. That's part of this, but you also have to make your own luck. And that was Urban Decay was an example of where a business was, taken on. $3 million is real money. Yeah. And yet they hit a home run. I mean, I look at another business today called AS Beauty, where we had Scott Kramer on. Right. Yeah. Scott Kramer, they bought that business. So what the backstory of that was, there were all these independent companies, Lord Geller, Mally Beauty, Julep Beauty, and they were hoovered up by a big private equity firm and a former CEO of L'Oreal or Estee Lauder or something like that. He, thought he could really run this thing and do something amazing. They unfortunately weren't able to mirror the successes of the big business that he came out of. AS Beauty were the former Elf Cosmetics team. They went in, bought it for $13 million, all of it. Wow. Today, Lord Geller is doing 750, 800 million by itself.
Yeah.
That's example of a distressed turnaround. And I had nothing to do with that other than watching from afar and Scott and Bobby and a few others there. But that's the perfect example of where if you can do it and you know the playbook, you can
do it again. Let me ask you a question, though. In each of these cases, there was an original founder group, like with Urban Decay, and then they took on an investment, and then they lost their mojo through that first round. What were the things that you see contributed to them in these different cases, taking that first dip or that second dip with, the second acquisition?
There's an interesting part, but let's be honest, it's money. When a business gets acquired, most of the time it's worth money, and therefore you're going to sell it. Somebody says to you, here's a Brinks truck full of cash. Are you going to turn it down? More likely than not, no. Especially in the consumer retail. In software, it's a little different because a lot of people will go out when they're cash poor as a software startup and go out and raise capital when they have nothing. So all of a sudden, it's not like you can just snap your fingers and sell it. Mm-hmm. you have to go to the board. The board's like, yeah, no, we want $1 billion, not 400 million. So you're going to sell it when it's $1 billion. And a lot of times it goes the other direction, right? It's, there are plenty of success stories out there that are, but there's a lot more success stories that aren't because of that. But that's because you took money too early. And you know what? I don't want to indict any people who are starting software companies, because you know what? You have to have the wherewithal to be able to support running this thing. And if you don't, you need to take money. And I don't blame that. I think that's actually the right move. You got to still be able to survive. You can't just, mortgage your entire life on it. And so that's different than a brand. Most of the time, brands bootstrap. They invest their life savings, or they invest their kids' college funds, or whatever the source of the cash is. And if somebody says to you, here's $200 million, I would be the same person. I'd take it right now. Right? I'd be like, hey, here's $200 million for X brand. Fine, here you go. Where do I sign? Right? Because the reality is now you've got a bunch of money in your pocket. Now you still can do an earnout. You still can do decently on the long haul. But the reality is, when you're in retail, consumer brand, CPG, manufacturing, the economics are different.
Yeah.
Versus where you are when you're starting up a company in like the software or the B2B SaaS or the SaaS side of things. So the reality is, going to what you're talking about, Barney, at the end of the day, what made it both appealing but then lost appeal was, when you're working for yourself, you control your own destiny. You have that fury, you have that fire. When all of a sudden you're working for board members who care about the return on their investment,
sure,
it's a different mindset. Right. And they don't care about, sort of the moonshots that are going to the boom or bust type of plays.
The nuances that are perhaps the essence of the brand to the consumer get lost. They get diluted.
Right. They certainly don't care about that. They just don't. It is a problem, but it's a good problem to have. It's also, you can do really well with it, but you have to figure out what it means to do well. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I love working on growth opportunities, because you haven't spent your budget in a lot of cases. It gives you a lot more opportunity to grow things. But the other side of it, right? The other challenge is when you go into a distress scenario. I call them sometimes special situations, which are one step beyond distressed, where you're like, hey, I've got 3 weeks, I've got a month, I've got 2 months, I've got 3 months. I don't have the luxury of time for you to figure things out. You've got to go now, right? What can you do in the next 3 days? Right. That's a frequent topic I get from people. What can you do?
Really, that's triage is really what it is. That's not all around. That's keep it alive for an extended period of time.
Right. It's not as simple, right, as, okay, if you're doing like things during the bankruptcy phase, that's a different scenario. And I've worked in that. I've had some fantastic mentors, Jonathan Greller being one of them. It was really tough to work with. But I learned so much from him in a short, condensed time that I still love talking to him. He is one of those that we should bring him on to the podcast, because he is one of those visionary people that I don't know if he actually views himself as that. He's much more pragmatic in his approach. But the reality is that from my view, you can work in these scenarios, but you have to know what you're going into. And when you're going into something that's for like a week, where they're like, can you turn this thing around in 3 days? The answer is no. Right. It's moving deck chairs on Titanic. It's not like it's just getting a financial, vehicle, like a financial lifeline, and all of a sudden you have 3 months or 6 months. In most cases, you're dealing with hours. Yeah. So I've been approached on a number of occasions. They're like, would you write a bank line for us, or get us a bank line, or financial savior? We'll give you 40% of the company, but we need it done by the end of the weekend. This is a Friday. And I'm like, no, that's not what I do. Here's 4 or 5 people. You can call them. They're probably going to say no to you, or they're going to ask you for 80%, 90% of the company. But reality is, this is for them. They're just trying to see how desperate you are. And in most cases, those companies go under usually the following Monday.
Anyway, right.
What makes a brand attractive enough to resurrect or turn around? I mean, what do you typically look for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, I have a formula in my head. Right. So the first step is, does anybody care about it anymore? Right? Does anybody care? And I look at things digitally because it's the easiest path forward. Like, you get into Google Search Console, are you getting a lot of traffic? Right? They may not be buying, but are you still getting the traffic?
You're getting the eyeballs, right?
Right? Like, look at emails. Are people opening the emails? They may not be clicking, but are they opening? Right? If they're not opening them, that's not a good sign, right? You could have a list of 4 billion, and still, if you're not getting them opening at all,
right,
the list, it's like tree and forest at that point. The other side of it is there enough brand reputation out there? And that's what a Google search is. I set up Google Alerts, right? It usually takes a couple days, but Google Alerts is a fantastic tool because it just calls everything that's out there, and away it goes. It's better than AI in that regard because AI is based off whatever the data availability is for that information, which Google Alert just doesn't care. They just basically just crawl the web and say, what do you want? Right? Give us a term and we'll do it the rest for you. And it's a lot of garbage. The other side is the community a type of it where they have a passion for that brand or for that retailer? Do they have a level of interest that's not going to be satiated anywhere else? Right? And that is something a little harder to determine. But if you've done this enough, you can tell pretty quickly that the community, do they tattoo their names on their arms? Right? Like, and there are brands that people do that with. Do they stand on top of a table and scream epithets about a brand? You know what? Negative is still pretty good because they're still talking about it. You can turn that, right? Like, so is there, they're not burning the house down. That's something different. But is there enough value in the public domain that makes this a worthwhile asset? So I looked at Modell's, I'm interim president over at Omni Retail Enterprises, working on the relaunch of these growth brands. They were called the dormant brands. That was the term, dormant brands, because they had shut down. 2021, 2022, they were over. And that was it. So the ironic part was they left the websites up. And normally I would walk into the scenario. First thing I would do is take down the websites because you don't want to have stuff that's like the websites. You can shop on them. And all the credit card processing was shut down, like literally severed. So even if you could purchase on the sites, you couldn't get the money. So I'm like, why spend the money at this stage? Just start over. But the reality was I actually went against what I would do in my playbook in this regard because I looked at it and Modell's was getting like 30,000 visitors a month. Right. 40,000 visitors a month. I was walking around. I'm like, hey, tell me about, do you remember Modell's? Oh, yeah, I went to the store last week. And I'm like, no, you didn't. That store hasn't existed since 2017. But that's, that tells you that people still love the brand. They still engage with the brand. There's still something there. I looked at Steinmart. I was getting like 50,000 visitors a month. And you're just like, wait a minute, these businesses are gone. Like, why? And so, from that view, it was very obvious to me that there is some staying power here. Like, people want it. Now, if you did a Google alert on it, the negative, this company, here's why they went out of business. Here are all the stores that are still sitting empty. Here's all of the bad stories of what they, of what the bankruptcy caused. That's unfortunately what you get with distressed or special situations or bankruptcies. You do get that. But and you know what, you have to work through that. But that's what marketing is for, right? That's marketing.
The noise gets quieter about those issues as the noise about the development gets louder.
But the reality is, as you're sort of evaluating this, the first question is really, is there something to latch onto? Like, do people care? If people don't care, I don't care what you do. Unless you're, it's just not, you're working so far uphill that it's almost insurmountable. And the question is, are you going to get somebody to write you a check or a bank to write you a check or a private equity firm to do it that gives you enough money to basically buy happiness at that point?
Right. So let me ask you a question about that noise that you're hearing, right? Okay. So you're going in, you're measuring noise. You're saying, okay, there's enough, there's 30,000, 50,000 in traffic, nothing to shop on, click or buy. Per se, what tools are you using to get down to, okay, of this 50,000, there's actually some commercial value to this demographic that's continuing to click through rather than they're just seeing it as, well, I used to love to be in the bathroom flipping the pages of the Sears catalog, sort of like I'm doing now with Modell's.
Yeah. It's a really good question because the problem you run into is exactly what you're describing, right? So say you make the decision, okay, right, I'm going to move forward on this, which is what I did. what does the first 90, 120, 180, 365 days look like?
Mhm.
And this is the biggest problem you run into is, does the business still have value in the market? So I was talking to a software company yesterday, and he was like, well, what makes you different? Like, there's Amazon, and then there's you. You're not doing anything differently. He was right. I didn't like the fact I was being insulted, but he was right, right? Like the way he said it was probably more, but he was actually correct, because that is the challenge you're running into. There's Amazon, there's Dick's Sporting Goods, right? There's Macy's, Bloomingdale's, there's, all these different companies, plus also the brands themselves. Why shop on you when you've been out of business for a while versus going pretty much anywhere else, that are still in business, that are still out there, that still have it. And that goes back to the brand visibility.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there enough here to get yourself going again, right? Is there enough discovery out there that you can basically start to rebuild that trust? And then, do you have an email list, right? So the brands we had, Steinmar had like 8 million email customers on the list, right? Like these email lists were really solid. It wasn't like you're dealing with 20,000 or 2,000, right? That's not a thing, right? So the reality is, you put up a website. You may not have everything, but you got to put up something. And what you do is in our case, we're using Marketplace to source a lot of this product, both private label as well as other companies. But the idea is, we also are doing research on what sold before.
Right.
What are we known for? Right? You can't be all things to all people. That's just not ever going to work. Besides the fact that you don't have enough time in the day.
Sure.
What we're doing is, I'm doing the research on the company, and I'm always doing it. Saying, what are we missing? What sold before we just didn't have? And then what else do we need to sell that, simply put, we don't have? And in some cases, you can't get it back. Like on Franklin Mint, we sold a ton of guitar picks. Like guitar picks, yeah, it was like a huge seller. They did like $200,000 a year in it.
Oh my goodness.
Out of business, right? The company that we sourced from went out of business. So I had to go find somebody else, but they went out of business. There's not much you could do about that one, right? And I reached out a bunch of times. I had a friend of mine, they were based in Nashville. I had a friend of mine who was in Nashville for work. I was like, can you do me a solid and go over there? And the guy sent me a picture, and he's like, yeah, they're not coming back. And I was like, well, and he goes, big giant sign that's in the built that said fire, like the Marshal Service or whatever says, fire restriction, because the building had burned down. Like that thing, like you saw a store closing on it anyway, but the building's gone, right? And so, clearly the fire, by order, the fire marshal would stay out, type of thing. And so that was a perfect example of you just can't get back into that. But there's your, that's you doing your research correctly. That's you investing the time to say, okay, what's the lowest bar for me to get to some level of success? And, I go back to this conversation because I actually, ironically, thought really hard to it on the conversation I had yesterday with the SaaS provider, where I was like, okay, what am I missing? We clearly have opportunities here. But he's right? I didn't like hearing it, but he's right. So where should I go? Like, what more should I be doing? Or should I start to change my thought process about how do I make it that you want to shop on a retailer versus shop with 5,000 other products versus shopping on one site, right? Or on the brands themselves. And the reality is that can it be that simple? Yes. But you got to make it simple. You got to make it easy for a person to purchase. You got to influence them to purchase on you versus going to the 15 other things out there. And with the web the way it is, with AI the way it is, with all the shopping assistants, it's a lot easier to go purchase on 15 different websites, right?
Yeah.
The reality is people still shop at Macy's, right? They're still buying. You can go to Eddie Bauer on eddieBauer.com. You can walk into an Eddie Bauer store, or at least I think you still can. But at the end of the day, people buy Eddie Bauer in Macy's. And the reason is it's easy.
Right.
It's simple, right? You get rewards and you can do a lot more with it. Yeah. There's that opportunity that you just have to figure out how to embrace.
Right. Unless they are that brand, as you said, that the customer likes to tattoo the name on their arm, and that might apply to, as you brought up, Eddie Bauer, might apply to a Patagonia, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, like you look at this, and it's the perfect example, right? It's look at a company called Karmaloop, right? Karmaloop was this fantastic business that they basically bootstrapped themselves. They were the first real retailer in streetwear and urban apparel. The way I say it is they put streetwear and urban apparel on the map. Mm-hmm. And they did affiliate programs. They did referral programs. They were fantastic. One of the smartest guys in the industry. The problem was he went from being bootstrapped to basically being handed a check, and there was a lot of money and they lost their way. And so we looked at this business. I did it with a private equity firm who had lent the money to them, and they took over. A lot of private equity debt firms don't want to own a company. That's why they get into debt. They don't want it's the least risky version of private equity. And so for them, they just wanted the ability to do what they need, to basically get their money back with interest. And so when we did the diligence, I said, you have to watch over this. This is the perfect example of a business that you have to pay attention to. It's not just you write them a check and you walk away and they hit their covenant, so they move on. This was one of those businesses where you just kind of have to check in on a regular basis because they could just go run wild. And that's exactly what happened. And so I got a phone call and they were like, can you help us figure out a way out of this? And we ultimately wound up running this business. It was me and there was two other people that were exceptionally smart, one of whom runs a successful software company called Postpilot today. We figure out, okay, what does this look like? Is the customer engaged enough that they'll come back? Because they got screwed by the bankruptcy. They lost all their assets. There was a guy who actually was given a gold-plated car because he was the number one referrer. They gave him a car, a Lexus painted gold car.
Good Lord.
Like, we were literally laughing. We were like, so we got the phone call like 2 days after the bankruptcy, and they were like, hey, you owe us the lease payment for this car. And we were like, what the hell are you talking about? Yeah. And we called in. We just started laughing. We were like,
wow,
yeah, we're not paying that like ever. Like, what are you doing? And that was the problem with that business, because they just spent money wildly because they didn't have that fiscal discipline. Whereas when they were bootstrapping, they had all that. And we ultimately were able to turn them and sell them in 10 months. And they did decently. I mean, the private equity firms who were involved could have done a lot better, obviously, but the reality is they were able to get out. And so this was another perfect example of where we were able to understand, okay, was there something worth saving? There was something that was salvageable. And then, okay, now what does that look like? And it's really basic, right? Whales and minnows. Peter Drucker, I've talked about him before. Best customers, worst customers. Mm-hmm. Exist, right? Did the best customers and the wannabe best customers focus on them? And what does that look like from a catalog standpoint? So that's the same thing on Steinmart. The same thing we're doing with Models. The same thing we're doing over there. And sometimes you miss. But the idea is basically, what does your best customer want? So in the case of Karmaloop, they had like a 9 million SKU catalog. I don't even know how you manage that. Like, that's ridiculous. Yeah.
It's an internet.
9,000, right? Or 12,000 SKUs, right? We went down to that number and we sold more.
Right.
We sold more. We were making a ton of money.
Of course, you narrow it down to what's working, and to that point in terms of what's happened over the last 10 years and the last 3 years in terms of AI and technology and its ability to help you, whether on a general level or specific platforms, to say, okay, what are my customers buying? What do they want? How quickly can, to your point, I got to turn this around in 8 days. What's been your best go-to tools or process to say, okay, I need to look at the merchandise from the last 2 years, the customer base, cross-reference, build a matrix, look at my product availability, and then, make decisions. So what's been your tool? Not that there's one.
Yeah, I was going to say there's not one.
Well, and in the past, you might have had to have separate teams for each brand. Today, with AI, are you able to combine some of that customer service, email, social, analytics?
It's a very good question, but I don't think we're replacing. We know who we're replacing? Interns. Mm-hmm. We're replacing interns, not analysts, not managers, directors, or whatever. You're replacing the busy work, the basic research. Like, the problem with AI, it's garbage in, garbage out, right? And so we're updating Steinmart. Like, we're doing a sale today, right? And so we had to build a whole catalog around watches, men's and women's watches. Mm-hmm. So, obviously I'm building a collection page using AI to generate the content. I'm giving it little tweaks, and it does inside the body of the text, instead of doing an and, it's doing an ampersand,
Mhm.
right? And you want the and. So it's men's, not ampersand watches in the text. You wanted to say men's and watches and women's watches.
Mm-hmm.
That's what an intern would do, right? In a lot of cases, they would take that shortcut because in most cases, you're not going to get caught. And so you don't know to, basically correct that as part of what you're doing as an intern. So I think AI is, in essence, it's very powerful, right? An intern's not going to write, a copy for 45 collections in an hour. There's no way that's ever going to happen. But my sense is a lot of that busy work is being taken care of. But you can't replace human muscle, human.
Amen to that.
You're shifting the bottleneck or the onus of work from labor to judgment. You're still going to need experienced people making those strategic calls and the fine decisions, the fine-tuning decisions.
Yeah, the fact that you can ask AI to create the spreadsheet and produce the margins and the summaries by category is pretty incredible. But yes, check the work.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, so building that report, Deanne, you're absolutely correct. When you build that spreadsheet and stuff, it used to take me weeks to build some of these spreadsheets to get them where I wanted to be. Now you can build them in hours or minutes.
Yeah.
But the problem is you still have to check the calculations. You still have to check the numbers. So I got challenged earlier in the week because we were at negative. Our margin fell to 5%. And I was like, why is this? And the person who I work for, he was asking the right question. He goes, why are margins 5%? That's terrible. He goes, are you paying attention to this? And the answer was, it wasn't the five. So Shopify, who we use on these sites, they basically looked at margin not as product margin, but it included its net margin. So it was gross and it was net, but it said it under gross. It didn't understand that there were two different things. So if I had spent the time, right, to really kind of drill into it, I would have caught it. So you view AI as this time saver, but in actuality, you've got to watch over what it's doing. It doesn't know any better. And the reason we were at 5% versus 38.1%, which is actually the gross margin, was because I had returns in there, I had vendor cancellations in there, I had other irregularities in there, I had a gift card purchase in there that we already sold a gift card, so it didn't even calculate that. It didn't even accept it as part of the margin. And that was margin. So the reality is that while it's doing what it thinks is best, in a lot of cases, it's doing what it thinks is best. It's not necessarily best. And so that is, that's the hurdle you really run into on that. So it's a big problem.
So AI is a time saver and a benefit. On the flip side, now you have tariffs as something, another new condition that's imposed on you that didn't used to exist. Are you having to run tariff scenarios now? And is that something that's a new layer that you're having to deal with during your due diligence period?
So, it's funny about the tariffs thing. There's plenty of suppliers, right? I was working for a manufacturing company called Camco 2 years ago, and it was a fantastic environment, fantastic experience. But it also, you had that tariffs layer in there too. And the problem was basically what you're describing. It's indiscriminate. Yeah. As a retailer, a lot of cases, you don't have to worry about the tariffs. You force that on your suppliers. You force that decision on the manufacturers. Amazon and Walmart is notorious that they're saying, here's the box, here's the number we will pay. Whether you pay, whether it's cost you get an extra 5% on your margin or you get none, that's your problem. Figure it out. That's not our problem. We will pay you 20 cents on the dollar for this product. Don't care the rest. And you're going to pay out all this other stuff and mark down dollars and other things. From that view, we're somewhat insulated. But once you get into private label, there's a scenario. I think the problem is it's indiscriminate, and you can't, while you're looking at your margin documentation, you're looking at your inventory balance, you're looking at your balance sheets, you're looking at your structures for your P&L and stuff. At the end of the day, that's where you push it on to the suppliers. And what the suppliers do is push it on to their suppliers. It eventually winds up where it needs to be. The problem is you're fighting over pennies of a dollar at that point, or fractions of a penny. Now, if you scale that, that's worth money. Remember The Office, right? Or Office Space?
I was just thinking.
I love that movie, Office Space. Yeah.
Where's my red stapler?
Right? And that piece of it, you can make an absolute killing on fractions of a penny.
Sure.
Yeah.
The problem is it's usually not the retailer that pays for it. It's usually the suppliers.
Mhm.
And I'm really bullish on suppliers. I'm really bullish on manufacturers. I think that's the next big front for opportunity. For me, I'm incredibly excited about it because I recognize their biggest hurdle is themselves. Right? They view it as, oh, well, Walmart will do it, or Amazon will do it, or Home Depot will do it, or wherever all these retailers, we don't have to worry about any of it. And that mindset is not correct. That mindset is, you know what? If you do it more, margin, you get margin. You don't have to fight with Amazon. And Amazon, your response to a Amazon, not saying this is what you should say to Amazon today, which is take it or leave it. Right? We're making all this extra money. We're throwing off all this cash. I'll give you one or two of the popular stuff, but I'm not necessarily giving you exclusives. Right. And I'm certainly not taking your crap. That changes the scenario for so many manufacturers. It's exceptionally scary, right? Let's be front. It is not easy to make that call. But if you can do it in the seat, you're in that governing seat that you can control what happens. You know what, Amazon, you don't want to give me that fraction of a penny? Okay, that's fine. I'll give it somewhere else to the people who are willing to work with me on it, who's willing to make sure that I stay afloat. And tariffs, unfortunately, as we've learned and come to and expect, unfortunately, about it, it's a fluid thing. Every week it changes. So it's one of those where you get worried about it and you're going to have to deal with it.
Lord, yeah. So you have 4 brands that you're bringing back right now. I think Modell's, Linens and Things, Steinmart, and the Franklin Mint so far.
Yeah.
But you're bringing them all back through e-commerce. So is that really specifically the vehicle to resurrect these brands, really, not brick and mortar?
I actually think brick and mortar is 100% where we should be. Brick and mortar is great discovery centers, right? I look at Bye Bye Baby as a perfect example. They needed stores. I'm not saying they needed 300 stores. I'm certainly not. I do not want to make that statement because I just don't know. But at the end of the day, you're pregnant, or you're part of a family, your wife is pregnant, you're, like whoever it is, grandparents, whatever, the task falls onto them, including the person who is pregnant, to basically buy quick, right? And discover what you need. And the problem is with online, you can't touch it and feel it, right?
I'm with you 100%.
Once you know about it, yeah, it's no problem, right? You're going to buy diapers for whatever the fastest is, just show up on your doorstep, because you don't want to even think about it. Why a company like diapers.com was formed and ultimately was successful and acquired. That set up Mark Lohr for what he was doing at jet.com and so forth and so on. And plaudits to him. But the reality is that's the point, was that diapers are one of those commodity-based things. And you can somewhat control pricing on that side. With regards to baby strollers, the bumpers, the cribs, basically I call it crap because I can't believe how much stuff I had, and you know what, you're buying it because you have no choice. The reality is you can't really differentiate. You can say you can, and most of it's through referral and friends and others. But when it comes to buying a crib, you want to touch it and feel it. Yeah. It's a personal decision, right? When it comes to a stroller, it's a personal decision. It's something that you need that discovery zone. And so it's specifically even about bed sheets. And, I talk about Linens and Things, where there's all those Wamsuta beds and, and the towels and stuff. I don't know how many times I've bought on Amazon and I'm like, that's not what this said, right? I see this thick pile and then I look at it. There's no thickness. It's just a pile, right? And so you turn around and you're like, wait a minute, what did I just buy?
I ran my Amazon list for doing my taxes, and the number of returns almost equaled the number of purchases I made.
And so from my standpoint, right, like that's a hurdle too.
Yeah.
Like I'll go on Ralph Lauren or Brooks Brothers or wherever I'm buying and buy like 10 items, and I return 9 of them, or 11 sometimes, right? Even though I bought 10, I now return 11. And so the reality is that, that's where businesses really want to avoid too, that re-commerce portion of it.
But at the same time, you're going to have plotting fees, volume commitments, marketing support, all of that in a store. And that's going to be a challenge for day one. So, it's I guess that's why it makes sense to start with e-commerce.
Right. Exactly. And so e-commerce is also, it's path of least resistance. It's the easiest. It's the one that you can get out the door quickest. You don't need the financial commitment, and you can get to marketing and exposure really fast. Mm-hmm. With a store, none of that occurs, right? Yeah. You need months. You need to buy inventory. You need to staff up. You need to, at least 2 people, right? One morning, one afternoon, or one evening.
Fixtures, right? You need lights.
You're putting out a ton of capital. You don't even throw out a number. You're just putting out a website, right? You can stand up a website. Most people can stand up a website today for like $200, right? Not $200 a month, $200, right? And so, versus where you're opening a store, you're not opening a store for $200. That's just not happening, right? You go to a flea market maybe, but you're not still doing that at a flea market either. The table and the chair or the tablecloth and just buying the product is more than $200.
Sure.
So the reality, that's the sort of the mindset. That's why online is the path of least resistance. It's the cheapest. It's not the most effective. No. When people ask me the first question, I used to say, "Oh, it's the internet. It's amazing. Look at all the opportunity." And then you turn around and you're like, I got more mature and also, it was the snapback effect. Today, I'm like, you need both. You need that discovery zone. It doesn't mean that you have to be only brick and mortar. There is a balance, and the endless aisle concept of online is massive. Bonobos was a perfect example of one, where they were able to build successful opportunities in business by having discovery zones, being able to try on, do the right measurements, but buying online and fulfilling out of the online side. But the other side of it is you can't be extreme one or the other. You have to have a careful balance, and that's really the ultimate issue with it.
I do know one example where they did start with bringing a brand back through stores, but it was really, they had no choice. It was Restoration Hardware when they rebranded to RH. They doubled down. They made palaces because they had to change their brand direction.
But also, to be fair, RH was a luxury brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't convey luxury on a website.
You're right. There's just no way to do that.
No.
It can, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah.
And the reality is,
but you have to supplement, as you said, the physical space, the discovery zone, the experience of a luxury brand.
Well, their average transaction is something in the $3,500 to $4,000 range, and that's not something that you're going to do online consistently, but you can do it in a physical store.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Allbirds. Anybody want to comment on Allbirds?
Oh, I'm so disappointed in them.
Well, the reality is that they were the same type of scenario, right? And so, the hurdle you run into is what's next for them, right? They were $1 billion aspect. I mean, I never looked at the decks or anything like that, but they were worth $1 billion or $2 billion. They were on fire, and then they weren't.
Yeah, well, I don't know who bought them, but they're pivoting evidently to something in the digital.
They are going to be yet another AI ChatGPT and Claude competitor. They're called Newbird now. Okay. Yeah, and they're selling off the IP for their shoes, and I can't remember who bought it, but and it's too bad because I love their shoes. I have a few pairs, and I like them. They're simple, they're comfortable, they breathe, they're great.
Well, and then I think, you get a company like a Skechers, which perhaps can eat some of their lunch as well, that you don't need in this day and age of order 5 pairs of something and return it.
Well, maybe that's what they did wrong. They didn't come up with a version that you could slip on and not have to bend over and tie.
Right. A la the Kizik patent, which has broken through to every major footwear brand now.
Yeah.
But you look at this, let's be fair, right? They tried to be all things to all people.
Yes, they got into clothing.
They wound up being nothing to no one.
Right.
And that's the sort of, that's the hurdle when you run into these scenarios, is that as we look at this, right, and this goes to the whole overarching conversation today, pretty much my map of my career, which is there enough there that people can identify with it?
Yeah.
Right? It's really that simple. If they water themselves down, can they get snapped back?
Right. Is there enough that's not been diluted that you can reconstitute? I don't know. Maybe that's sort of like I'm using both words.
Diluted,
but
Yeah, I mean,
I look at Crocs and what they were able to do when they sort of like faded out and then bring in some really interesting cross-cultural cross-branding with the gibbets and food.
Oh yeah, they were almost dead.
And yeah.
Well, look at Polaroid. Polaroid has been sold into bankruptcy 3 separate times. And third time's the charm, evidently, because they're doing well now. So finally, they found their audience.
Right.
But that's, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, in terms of summary, right, to summarize this conversation, when you're looking at these overarching like, big brands or small brands, $1 billion, BlackBerry, right? Like, look at all these. And you're like, hey, can you rebuild it? Is there enough here? Do people want it back? Right. And not to go, into crypto and
complain about missing their BlackBerry to this day.
Right. Like, the reality is there enough here? Napster, right? Is there enough with Napster that you're going to be able to invest in it and be able to rebuild it? Maybe not what it was, but where people are still paying dollars for it, like real dollars. Is there a 30 million or 40 million? People ask me all the time, can we get back to $1 billion? I'm like, no. Right? I'm like, because you can't, like, get to 5 million first before you get to $1 billion. Like, the reality is, can we get to 5 million? Can we get to 1 million? Can we get to 2? Don't think, oh, I'm going to make this into $1 billion company. That's awesome. And so the way I always ask people too, and the way I say it for myself is, what's my exit? If I get to 100 million in revenue, I'll sell it. Like, that's what I want. Because then people turn around and like, oh, I want 2 billion. I'm like, yeah, that's not happening. Yeah. Right. That's great to dream about, but you have a better shot of doing that during the lottery. Right. Like, the way this is you have to think through, okay, is this viable? Is there an opportunity here? And then you have to be smart enough to know when to take a risk, and then the opposite, not to. Yeah. And I'll admit I made mistakes, right? We all have. But at the end of the day, my successes are larger and more profound than my mistakes, or I haven't been caught yet on it.
Just like a good merchant, you take your markdowns and you come out with a profit at the end of the day.
Right.
Here's a question. Some of the brands that you've acquired, and even private equity on average, a lot of the brands they will pull out of distress or even closure can be 10 to 20 years old. And the original prime cohort, they've probably aged out of buying the way that they used to. But there's still nostalgia for their kids, for their children. How do you market to that demographic? Is that possible to kind of resurrect the brand through the children of the original cohort and to bring that back? And how do you go about bringing up the cultural memory of that brand?
It's a really good question. So the best example, I look at a company called Altered State. I'm not saying they were distressed or anything like that, but they're very successful at generational selling. Mm-hmm. So they got the sort of the middle child, I think, the moms. The moms then brought their daughters, and their daughters brought their grandparents, right, or grandmothers. And so they all buy. Grandmothers are buying for their granddaughters, but they're also buying for their daughters too, right? And they've done an exceptional job. I can't speak to the profitability of it because I don't have visibility to, but they've done an exceptional job of just creating demand. That's part of the problem with, even when I'm focusing on Modell's. Mm-hmm. I say to people, I need to go to the people who know the Modell's brand to get them to buy for their kids. Mm-hmm. And I have to have enough staying power for them to say, oh, I love Modell's. I bought all my equipment. I'm just going to buy my equipment from them. And that's the point. That's a positive, but it's a big uphill climb because there's Dick's Sporting Goods. They're fantastic what they are. But what I'm trying to do is weasel in for a percentage.
Sure.
But is a big behemoth. They have Foot Locker now. They have Champs. They have all these brands. Right. But I'm trying to weasel in to get a portion of their business. Yeah. And that's the whole idea here is, I'm going to harken back to that conversation with the SaaS provider that I met with yesterday. He was like, what makes you different? You're right. What makes me different? I don't really like talking, in those extreme terms, but that is ultimately across all the businesses I've ever worked on, from college bookstores to, streetwear urban apparel, to Diane Von Furstenberg and the luxury and aspirational apparel, to Destination Maternity, which was pregnancy wear, to BCBG, and so forth and so on. the end of the day, is there staying power with the existing customer base? And is there enough to get the expanded customer base? Can I go older? Can I go younger? Right? And people are like, well, if you go too old, it'll die off. I'm like, in 20 years or 10 years.
Right. We can work them for a while.
I'm like, I want to get to a year. I'm not trying to get to 10 years from now.
Right.
That's, hopefully we've sold the business and I'm not worried about it. My goal is, can I get enough from the sort of the halo effect, but it's really, can I get back to that customer we already have?
Can you right the ship and move it in the right direction, keep the passengers that you still have on board? And
so where are the prime hunting grounds for distressed assets today? Are there certain categories or brand types that you think are worth looking at?
I get asked this a lot by friends, others in the industry, and they're like, hey, where can I go find
Tell me your secrets. That's what you probably get asked all the time.
Yeah, where can I find a cheap beach house?
Yeah, I mean, there's no real answer. A lot of it is being in the industry or keeping your ear to the ground, doing a ton of networking. Also just paying attention. Somebody is not going to just hand it to you. That's just not true. That's true with life. That's true with working. It's along the lines of, is there enough there? Is there something clicking in your head? That's basically what it comes down to. Mm-hmm. That's really, it's
not like there's distressedbrands.com that you can go to like a marketplace.
Yeah.
And the most recent examples I've seen are large companies that are starting to divest of some of the things that are not aligned with their growth strategy or not performing as well when they need cash. And I think Torrid is one of those brands that's been on the market and it's being sold off.
Yeah.
And so companies like that, the plus size market is not, it needs a home. So somebody buying
that's part of the Ozempic syndrome.
Yeah. And then Unilever is divesting itself of some brands that aren't really fitting in. And I know they sold off Kate Somerville, that product. It was required by a private equity company called Rare Beauty Brands, which is different from the Rare Beauty makeup line for some reason.
There's a lot of stories and a lot of companies out there, and there's a lot of things. It's one of these where you just have to pay attention. Like I read a ton. I do a lot of networking. I go out and hang out in a variety of spaces, but I'll admit a lot of it is luck, right? Too, right? But you have to make your own luck. I'm a big believer in that. And so I tell my kids this all the time: put yourself in a situation where you can get lucky. Don't fight uphill. Like you're just, there's no reason to it. You have to, like my kids ask all the time, why are you networking? And the answer is because I don't know what's the next step.
Right.
So I'm trying to find that next step.
So to that point, because I think we all benefit, the three of us and everybody, we talk about meeting in public and going in public, and you said networking, and whether it's online or participating in conferences, like there's NRF, there's Commerce Next. Where do you tell VCs, prospective partners in this space to go to find those people in conversations, or just hear, what the hubbub is?
I change out my networking groups usually once every 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. Because I find that the networking groups that I belong at the time, I just burn out. Right, like you become too familiar, you become too comfortable. Mm-hmm. And so I change them out pretty regularly. And
like your merchandising,
right? And so, I would love to say that there's some sort of special indicator that's going to be how you say, oh, this is the place to go, or that's the place to go. There really is, and then what works for me may not work for others. It's just more of a question of surround yourself with the right people, mix of people. Don't be shy to talk to people and get out there. I'll question, I stay home because I just wanted to stay home one day and be like, I missed a networking event and I feel bad about it. And I'm like, what could I have learned when I was there? But at the end of the day, I missed out. It's just what happens.
It is what happens. Can't get every deal, every piece of information.
Exactly.
This has been fascinating. I've enjoyed this. Gosh, you're a cool dude.
I wish my kid said that.
Yeah, it doesn't happen. You know,
Don't
later
hold your breath.
on reflection, when they're in their late 30s, they'll say, you know, Josh, he wasn't half bad. He was kind of a
Yeah. Wait till they have their own kids. Then
Yeah.
they'll appreciate it.
exactly. All right, folks, really a pleasure.
It was really fun.